still in this section of court tales. Remember, first 6 chapters of Daniel's book has a series of court tales where Daniel and his friends, as members of the Babylonian court, are in confrontation with the Babylonian king. And in that confrontation, they are protected and ultimately exalted by their God. Their God hasn't abandoned them. Their God's not a local deity back in Palestine. No, actually, their God's the true God of the world. He's the Most High God. And so this is another of those court scenes that we've been looking at in these first 6 chapters. And also, just to remind you of the structure, this unusual chiastic structure functions like an X, where the center is the main point of the entire section. We're in Daniel 5, and so it pairs with the previous chapter, that God the King is able to humble those who exalt themselves against him. Last time we saw that theme with Nebuchadnezzar. This time we're going to see it with Belshazzar, but as we're going to see, and as you saw, as you studied this passage this week, there's a tight connection between the 2 chapters. The scenes of chapter 4 are going to be repeated in chapter 5, and it even heightens the effect that Daniel is trying to make. The hinge on which these 2 chapters, those who walk in pride, he's able to humble King Belshazzar. Right? That's the hinge. So the way these chapters are structured, so that 4 and 5 are together, chapter 4, verse 37, and chapter 5, verse 1 connect together. And indeed, the surprise at the end of this chapter shows that God is able to humble those who exalt themselves against him. This is a public section. It's meant to be accessed not just by God's people, but also by the Babylonians. And it's significant. It's significant for Israel. They're exiled in Babylon. They hear the claims of the pagan religion around them, that their god Marduk has defeated Israel's God by defeating Israel, that they would be in Israel's hand forever. How would Israel work their way through that? How would they remain? How would they hold on to their confidence that in fact their God's the true God who's going to deliver them from exile? Well, these scenes give Israel confidence that in fact God would deliver, and especially that God would keep his promises made hundreds of years before in the book of Isaiah. Isaiah 45 it looms in the background of all of these scenes, but it's particularly important here, I think. Isaiah 45, so you know how the section that begins in Isaiah 40 starts, where the prophet cries out, "Comfort, comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem. Cry to her that her warfare is ended, her iniquity is pardoned. She's received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins." And so you move through Isaiah, the first chapters of Isaiah 40, 41, 42. "Fear not, I'm with you. Be not dismayed. I am your God. I uphold you with my powerful right hand. When you go through the fires, I'll be with you. When you go through the waters, you will not drown." And you go through those first chapters in these wonderfully comforting scenes. But the payoff of that comfort that God is giving to his people, starting in Isaiah 40, actually comes in Isaiah 45. "Thus says the Lord to his Messiah, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have grasped, to subdue nations before him, and to loose the belts of kings, to open doors before him, that gates may not be closed. I will go before you and level the exalted places. I will break in pieces the doors of bronze and cut through the bars of iron. I will give you the treasures of darkness and the hoards in secret places, that you may know that it is I, the Lord, the God of Israel, who call you by your name. For the sake of my servant Jacob and Israel, my chosen, I call you by your name. I name you, though you do not know me. I am the Lord, and there is no other. Besides me, there is no God. I equip you, though you do not know me, that people may know from the rising of the sun and from the west that there is none besides me. I am the Lord, there is no other. I form light and create darkness. I make well-being and create calamity. I am the Lord who does all these things." Well, this this prophecy that Isaiah gives concerning Cyrus is given around 730. 200 years later, how is God going to keep this promise? Israel has this promise, this prophecy that this king named Cyrus is going to come. He's an anointed one, a Messiah. He's going to come and level the world. He's going to deliver God's people so that he would know and the world would know that Yahweh is in fact the true God. How's that going to happen? 200 years later, here it is. These scenes are connected together with Cyrus, God's anointed, God's Messiah, coming to deliver his people so that his people might be set free and they might go home. This is looming in the background. And so this gives God's people huge confidence because it's happening right here. We're going to see the punchline is this is the last night of the Babylonian Empire. This whole section from chapter 2 to chapter 7 is centered right here to give confidence to God's people. Now, when you read this, it's the transition from scenes with Nebuchadnezzar to verse 1, King Belshazzar, may seem incredibly abrupt. We have to remember that these are not this isn't necessarily a history of Israel and Babylon. It's not a biography of Daniel. This is a theologically arranged account so that it makes clear who's the true king and that Israel's God, the true king of the world, is able to humble those who walk in pride, the Babylonians especially. And it's when you get to this chapter and you finally get to the punchline, it's surprising, but it's not completely surprising because all throughout the first 4 chapters, there have been clues that, in fact, Babylon's going to fall, that Daniel's collected these materials and put these materials together from the perspective that Babylon has fallen. So in chapter 1, verse 21, Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. So Isaiah 45, well, Daniel tells you in his very first chapter, here he is. He's going to show up in this story. In chapter 2, it's the key issue that Nebuchadnezzar's frightened to death that there might be a change in the seasons. That's why he refuses to tell his dream to his magicians. He says, if you do not make the dream known to me, there is but one sentence from you. You have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me until the times change. What does that mean? Well, as you remember, the times changing really means the regime's changing, the kingdom's changing. And that shows up even in Daniel's prayer back to God in chapter 2, verse 20. Daniel answered and said, blessed be the name of God forever and ever, to whom belong wisdom and might. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. So the kings will change not because simply of the machinations of men. Ultimately, God's the one who changes kings, raises up one, puts down another. And in the dream that Daniel interprets for the king, what do you find? Well, you, O Nebuchadnezzar, you're the head of gold, but after you is going to come another empire. There shall rise after you a kingdom inferior to you, and yet a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over the earth. Babylon's not going to last forever. And then in chapter 4, the previous scene, Nebuchadnezzar's tree is cut down. It signals ultimately the change of kingdoms, and the refrain that occurred over and over that we saw shows up 3 times in chapter 4, 17, 25, and 32. Until the living may know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will and sets over it the lowliest of men. So already throughout these first 4 chapters, you've been given clues. Babylon's going to come to an end. Cyrus is going to come. God's going to keep his promises, which signals what? The return from exile, the return to the promised land. This is how God's going to keep his promises concerning that land. This is how God's going to keep his promises concerning a Davidic king. This story is already telling you that Babylon's going to come to an end, that Persia is going to rise, that Cyrus the Anointed is going to level them, and that Cyrus is going to let God's people go home. So with all of that in mind then, these very first words, King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of 1,000, raises the whole question, well, where did Belshazzar come from? What's his paternity? Especially in the next verse, and it says, Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold, of silver, and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought. So, who's King Belshazzar, and how is Nebuchadnezzar his father? So I've brought back this little chart of the history of the Babylonian kings from the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And you can see there's one guy above all others who stands out. That's Nebuchadnezzar. He rules for over 40 years. And after Nebuchadnezzar dies, you see that there's a number of kings in rapid succession. His son, Evil Merodach, only rules for 2 years. He's assassinated. Another king rules for 4 years. He too will be assassinated. His assassinator, he lives 2 months before he's assassinated. So there's great instability after Nebuchadnezzar leaves the scene. Eventually, a king that's not related to Nebuchadnezzar, a military leader, a general now named I knew I was going to mess this up. Nabonidus becomes king, but in this coup that Nabonidus works, he's not a son, he's a usurper, but he's also a religious other. The main god in the pantheon of Babylon is Marduk. Nabonidus is actually he's heterodox. He thinks that the moon god Zin should be the chief of the pantheon. So it appears that what happens is that Nabonidus' co-conspirators put him forward to lead the coup, and then they quickly exile him. And it might be that his son, Belshazzar, was part of those co-conspirators, was more politically correct in terms of seeing Marduk as the great high god of the Babylonian pantheon, and he is made co-regent. Nabonidus is packed off and sent off to Palestine and Egypt and other places in the empire, and Belshazzar becomes co-regent. So all that's kind of lurking in the background. Belshazzar comes to the throne ultimately through a coup. He's not in the direct line of Nebuchadnezzar, which raises the question again, well then, how's Nebuchadnezzar his father, right? It says Nebuchadnezzar his father, and that's going to be stressed in the speech by the Queen Mother as well. Well, it appears that the language that's being used here is really a metaphor. Nebuchadnezzar is not strictly his father, his grandfather, but more of a downstream metaphor that in the ruling line of Babylon, you have those above you, your predecessors were your fathers. Those downstream from you were sons, not necessarily in a strict genealogical line, but in terms of the use of power. And we use this kind of language even today. If you go to a presbytery meeting or a general assembly meeting of our denomination, inevitably the language that will be used in speeches will be fathers and brothers. Well, strictly speaking, there's very few people in that room. I mean, my dad's a ruling elder, so maybe if my dad was in the room, when I said fathers and brothers, I could be speaking of him. But by and large, that's a metaphor, right? We're respecting those who are older than us, but also recognizing that we stand in their line in a metaphorical way in terms of the use of authority, not in terms of paternity. And that's how it's being used here. Nebuchadnezzar is a father of Belshazzar in the sense that he uses power as king of Babylon, and Belshazzar, the rightful ruler of Babylon, stands in that line of being a father to Babylon, and so is a son of Nebuchadnezzar. So that's who Belshazzar is. That's how he came to power. That's how he relates to Nebuchadnezzar. But in asking for these vessels of gold and silver that Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem, Belshazzar commits profanity and folly. Now, we think of profanity as cuss words. He's not cussing, but he is profaning. And the profanity occurs when he takes these temple vessels, these sacred vessels that have been dedicated to the use of God, and he uses them to do what? Well, verse 3. Then they brought in the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Now, first of all, in drinking from those secret vessels and praising other gods, they're not just profaning God's things, they're profaning God himself. These sacred vessels set apart to God's use were claimed by God. So to mock God's stuff is to mock God himself. But it's notable, and this was something that I didn't see in a commentary. This was just something that popped when I was studying all this. Did you notice they praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone? Well, think back to that statue that Nebuchadnezzar saw. What was the statue? Well, he saw this statue. The head of the image was fine gold. Its chest and arms were silver. Its middle and thighs of bronze. Its legs of iron. Its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. Most of those materials that Nebuchadnezzar saw in the statue in chapter 2, these are the gods that they praise, the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone, that they praise using the sacred vessels in chapter 5. I don't think that's an accident. I think Daniel's wanting you to make these connections. They're praising the gods of the kingdom. They're praising the gods that have given them power. They're praising Marduk and his pantheon. And they're using the sacred vessels to do this profaning work. But remember what happened in chapter 2? That statue with all those different metals representing the kingdom, what happened to the statue? It was crushed by a boulder not made with hands that was in fact the kingdom of God. And what's going to happen here? Israel's God is going to eliminate this alleged power that praised its glory and drank to its gods. Going to crush it. Going to crush it with Cyrus, but ultimately there's going to be one, a son of man given power by the Ancient of Days who's going to rule over this world forever. So in drinking from these vessels, they weren't simply profaning God's stuff, they were profaning God himself, as Daniel was going to say later in his own speech when he says in verse 23, "You have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which you do not see, hear, or know. But the God in whose hand is your breath and whose are all your ways, you have not honored." So that's the profanity. But profaning God's things and ultimately profaning God, that's folly. They thought that God didn't see. They thought Israel's God didn't know. He's back in Palestine. He's a local deity. He has no authority here in Babylon. No, that's folly. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. The fool says God cannot see. And you see that folly because in verse 5, they drank wine and praised the gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone immediately. Like, no delay. As soon as the words were on their lips, profaning those elements and profaning God and committing this folly, immediately the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace opposite the lampstand. The king couldn't miss it. It's opposite the lampstand. It was as though there was a spotlight on the hand of God writing on the wall. And when the king sees the hand, what happens? The king saw the hand as it wrote. The king's color changed. His thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way and his knees knocked together. He loses control of his bodily functions. Here we begin to see some of what's happened previously. Nebuchadnezzar has these dreams. He's disturbed. What does he do? What's his first response? Well, Nebuchadnezzar's first response was to call for the magician to try to get an interpretation that same thing happens here. Verse 7, the king called loudly to bring in the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers. The king declared to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation shall be clothed in purple and have a chain of gold around his neck and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king the interpretation. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed, and his color changed, and his lords were perplexed. Look, notice there that this paragraph, verse 5 and verse 9, are bookended with the language of the king being alarmed and his color changed. Everything in between is why. He sees the hand of God. He doesn't know what it means. And he's convinced that this portent means something significant. So King Belshazzar commits profanity in using the vessels that belong to God and so profaning God, and that's his folly. His folly is seen both in mocking the God in whose hand is his life, but also in running to these magicians who we've already seen in Daniel's book in chapter 2 and chapter 4. They can't help you. There's only one guy in this story who can help, and his name is Daniel. And the three speeches that follow make that plain. These three speeches, the queen mother to Belshazzar, Belshazzar to Daniel, and then Daniel to Belshazzar, they are the main substance of the chapter. And they focus both on Daniel as a worthy interpreter, one who has the spirits of the gods, but also they focus on the fact that Daniel's God, the true God of the world, the true king of the world, is able to humble those who claim authority over the world. So the first speech is the queen mother to Belshazzar in verses 10 to 12. Says, the queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banqueting hall. And the queen declared, O king, live forever. Let not your thoughts alarm you, or your color change. That's the third time that's mentioned. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. In the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom like the wisdom of the gods were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and astrologers, because an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. Now, we aren't sure exactly who this queen was. If you have an ESV Bible, you have a footnote there. It says, or queen mother. And I think that's likely the case because the queens, his various concubines, his wives, were already with Nebuchadnezzar. You see that back in verse 3. The king and his lords and his wives and his concubines drank from the sacred vessels. So this queen was not necessarily a wife, so who is she? Well, likely the queen mother. It could mean that this is in fact Belshazzar's mother, one of Nabonidus' wives. But it's also possible that this is one of Nebuchadnezzar's many wives who survived the years of regime change, over now 23 years of regime change, and somehow through all the machinations of Babylonian court politics, she has survived. That would explain, I think, her positive view of Daniel, but also the repeated emphasis on Belshazzar's father, Nebuchadnezzar. 3 times you have that language, in the days of your father, the king Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king. Well, as we've already said, Nebuchadnezzar, strictly speaking, is not biologically related to Belshazzar. So she's emphasizing the fact that there was a prior ruler who stood in your line in ruling over Babylon who was much wiser than you because he paid attention to this man Daniel. And what we're going to see, too, is there's a suggestion here that Belshazzar has placed Daniel in a lesser position. He used to be chief of the magicians, but now he's a lower-level functionary who is on the outs of Belshazzar's court. And so perhaps her positive view of all of this is because she's actually one of Nebuchadnezzar's former wives that was not killed in regime change, but actually remains in the court. Notice, too, that she says that Daniel is a man in whom the Spirit is the Spirit of the holy gods. That's a phrase that's used in different ways to make reference to the fact that Daniel has been given something by God. From the very first chapter, you heard that in chapter 1, verse 17. As for these youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Where did that come from? Well, not from Daniel. From the very first chapter, we're told it comes from God. Daniel himself will say that also. In chapter 2, the magicians tell Nebuchadnezzar, no one can interpret this. No one can show it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with the flesh. But when Daniel and his friends pray to the true God of the world, he gives them the interpretation. And Daniel says, he reveals deep and hidden things, this our God does. He knows what's in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. To you, O God of my Father, I give thanks and praise. For you have given me wisdom and might, and you have now made known to me what we asked of you, for you have made known to us the king's matter. And Nebuchadnezzar himself in chapter 4, 3 times tells Daniel that he has the spirit of the holy God. So by the time you get to chapter 5 and you hear the queen mother say this, you know, yes, Daniel has the spirit of the holy gods, not because of himself, but because God himself is the one who's giving the interpretation. God himself is making these things known. The God who's written the words in judgment has given the interpretation of those words, so that even the Babylonians will know that God, Israel's God, is in fact the true king of the world. It's what God said back in Isaiah 45. I am the Lord. There is no other. I form light and create darkness. I make well-being and create calamity. I am the Lord who does all those things. That's what God wants even the Babylonians to know. And the queen mother's speech reminds everyone that is in fact the case. So that's the first speech. The second speech is Belshazzar to Daniel, starting in verse 13. Then Daniel was brought in before the king, and the king answered and said to Daniel, you are that Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah, whom the king my father brought from Judah. I have heard of you that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom is found in you. Now, the wise men, the enchanters, have been brought in before me to read this writing and make known to me its interpretation, but they could not show the interpretation of the matter. But I have heard that you can give interpretations and solve problems. Now, if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Well, this is quite a speech. Now, Belshazzar knows Daniel. He calls him one of the exiles of Judah. That language, remember, is used in chapter 3 with Daniel's 3 friends, these Jews, these exiles from Judah. It's going to show up in the next chapter when Daniel goes and prays. His enemies will come and accuse him as an exile from Judah. Belshazzar trots this out quickly. You're that Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah, but he knows him. How do we know? Well, we know that he knows him because he says something that the queen mother didn't. The queen mother in her speech speaks of Daniel's qualifications in relationship to Nebuchadnezzar. Here, Belshazzar says, oh, you're that exile from Judah. Yeah, you're that Daniel. I've heard of you. But we also know that Belshazzar knows about Daniel because of what happens later in the book. In Daniel chapter 8, there's one of the visions that Daniel will have, a vision of a ram and a goat. That chapter begins, in the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me. So sometime around 547 or so, Daniel has that vision in the reign of King Belshazzar. And at the end of the vision, chapter 8, verse 27, and I, Daniel, was overcome and lay sick for some days. Then I rose and went about the king's business. But I was appalled by the vision and did not understand it. In other words, Daniel was not completely out of power. He wasn't completely out of the court. He was still doing the king's business during the reign of King Belshazzar. But it's clear he doesn't hold his former position. as chief of the magicians, as the one to whom Nebuchadnezzar in times past had turned. So in the reorganization that Belshazzar had worked, Daniel had been moved down the ladder. So when he says to Daniel, "Oh, you're that Daniel. I'd almost forgotten about you. You're one of the exiles from Judah." He's kind of mocking him. He's kind of putting in the knife a little bit and twisting it. But there's an irony here. Belshazzar had profaned Israel's God. And the only person who could actually interpret the handwriting on the wall, which, by the way, is the handwriting